In Malachi, the Bible says this, Malachi chapter 3. But who can endure the day of the Lord's coming? Who can stand when the Lord appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and launderer's soap. He will set as a refiner and a purifier. He will sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver. He will purify the sons of Levi, purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness. What is Malachi doing there? He is giving us a word picture of what a refiner does. In the days of Jesus, in the days of Malachi, a refiner or the smelter would have a big, large pot that would be filled with gold or filled with silver, as Malachi uses both silver and gold. And what the refiner would do, this would be this pot, there's a fire underneath, the gold would be in it, and the hotter the fire would get, or the hotter the gold or silver would get, the more of the impurities, the dross, the yuck would float to the top. And the refiner would scoop off the dross. He'd scoop off the drudge, all of the impure things. He'd throw them away. And as the fire would continue to burn and the gold would continue to be hotter and hotter and hotter, the hotter it got, the more the impurities would come to the top and the more stuff would be taken off the top. The way that the smelter or the refiner would know when the gold was ready or the silver was ready is he would look at his pot, and when he could see the reflection of his face, he knew it was done. This is how God works in our lives. The same principle is taught in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, one of the first verses that you memorize when you're a new Christian, God works all things together for good. And then sometimes Christians stop right there. He works all things together for good. Woohoo! But then it goes on and says, for those who love him and for those who are called according to his purpose, for he is conforming them into the image of his Son. It's the refiner's fire principle. He's conforming us. So when he looks at us, he sees Jesus. The impurities, the dross, we go through the refining process. The fire's turned up hot sometimes and it's miserable. The conforming into the image of his Son. We like all things working out for good. But the conforming into the image of Jesus, that God the Father would see the Son in us, that whole conforming process, it hurts when God is pushing us on the sides. It hurts when he takes out his chisel and has to chisel a little bit more of us. So how does this work out here in John's Gospel? Well, we're going to see how it works out in John's Gospel as we are going to be with Jesus, who is the master of the storms. And quite frankly, there are storms that come into our life, trials that come into our life, and the Lord even sends us into those. Well, how is that possible that it would work out in such a way as this? Well, we're going to see that in just a minute. So we're going to pick up in John chapter 6 from where we were last time. Now, last Sunday was Easter. The Sunday before is Palm Sunday. So you got to go back a few weeks in your mind and remember where we were. And if you weren't with us a few Sundays back, that's okay, because this is super easy. You'll be able to connect without needing to revisit. But in John chapter 6, where we left off, Jesus had just fed 5,000 men, and we know from the other gospel accounts, 5,000 men plus women and children. Probably 25,000 people somewhere in this vicinity along the shores or above the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He fed them with just 2 fish and a few loaves of bread. 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And he managed to feed 25,000 people. It was a miracle. And the people were excited. They thought, wow, this is great. We have a miracle worker here. Let's make him king. Well, let's see how this works out. You ready? As we're going to be with Jesus, the master of the storms, John chapter 6, picking up from where we were, verse 15. John 6, verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king. In other words, when the people who got the happy meal, the 25,000 people that got fed, woohoo! This is a great miracle. He's the king. He's the one that's going to destroy the Romans. Let's make him our king. The problem was, they didn't want a king of their souls. They didn't want a king to bring them forgiveness. What they wanted was just a king to make them happy. They wanted someone who would conquer the Romans and who would also give them a free meal when they wanted it. Therefore, verse 15 again, when Jesus perceived they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus departed to the mountain by himself alone. Verse 16, now when evening came, his disciples, they went down to the sea. And they got into the boat, and they went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But Jesus said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Well, that's all we're going to read here in the Gospel of John. John, Mark, and Matthew all talk about this event of the disciples on this boat while Jesus is on the mountaintop and them being in the sea. Matthew gives us details that both John and Mark do not give us. In fact, in Matthew's gospel, in fact, if you would, please turn to Matthew chapter 14, and we're going to see this, and we're going to read a few other details. Matthew tells us that this is the place, this is the storm, when the disciples are on the boat, when Peter walks on the water. Now, John doesn't tell us that Peter walked on the water. I think perhaps John was a little bit jealous that Peter walked on the water and he didn't. Maybe that's why John left this out. I don't know. But in Matthew's account, Matthew gives us details that John does not give us. So from Matthew chapter 14, let's check this out, and we get a little bit more insight, and this becomes really, really interesting. You ready? Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22. Immediately, so this is right after the thousands of people were fed by the miraculous fish and the loaves, the distribution of them. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So you're tracking, right? Jesus, we know, goes up on the mountainside to pray. John told us that. The disciples get into a boat, go to the other side. We're going to find out that the disciples delayed a few minutes or a little while. But he sent the multitudes who wanted to make him king. He sent the multitudes who he just fed all of the fish and all of the loaves. He sent them away. You guys go away. You disciples go in a boat, go to the other side. And notice he did tell them to the other side. So because Jesus says the other side, they were going to get to the other side. Jesus goes up on a mountain, top alone. Verse 23, and when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, Jesus was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out for fear. I find this interesting in this story that they see Jesus walking. They're in a storm. They're in the middle of the sea. It's dark. And they see Jesus and they think he's a ghost. And they're afraid. We often have the same reaction. We pray, Lord, help me through this, whatever this is. And he sends his help. But his help doesn't come in the way that we were expecting his help to come. And sometimes we think, what is this? Get away. Lord, you're supposed to do this like this. I don't get this. Sometimes we're afraid of what we see. But he doesn't always answer us the way that we expect him to answer. This is out of the box. The disciples are in the middle of the sea. Earlier in the day, they see him feed the thousands and thousands of people. And suddenly, He's walking on the sea towards them. Wait a minute, this doesn't work. We can do the same thing. Lord, you're not supposed to answer us like this. But the people, they don't like this idea. They wanted Jesus to be a king who conquered the Romans. They didn't want a king over their souls. They wanted a king who was going to feed them free food. They didn't want a king to forgive them of their sins. So Jesus sends them away. He sends the disciples. He makes them go in a boat. He's sending them to, the first verse 22 tells us, to the other side. Right? And we pick up four things that we can pick up from this passage. Number one is this: Jesus sent the disciples into the storm. Understand this. This is contrary to popular opinion. Why would the Lord send his own children into a trial? Why would he send his own children into a storm? Because he is molding us into the image of Jesus. He is refining us, like Malachi wrote. As a refiner refines the gold, refines the silver to get rid of all the yuck. That's what the Lord is doing. This is really cool. If you ever go to Israel with us, one of the things you get to do is you get to go on a boat like this on the Sea of Galilee. And in fact, in 2006, when we were on the Sea of Galilee, this was really exciting. It was my first time going and taking a tour group with me. And I had put it off for years and put it off for years and put it off for years. Finally, I decided I needed to go. So we were at a kibbutz where we had St. Peter's fish, and then after we had the St. Peter's fish for lunch, we got into one of these boats, the group did, and we're on the boat, and it's a beautiful day. We get out about into the middle of the Sea of Galilee. I am not exaggerating this. You can ask anybody who was on that trip. There were a small group, about 20 of us, and out of nowhere, a storm came, and the wind picked up. And the rain started coming like crazy, and the clouds and the thunder and everything. We're on the middle of the Sea of Galilee. I've got my Bible open. I am ready to teach a message about the storm on the Sea of Galilee and Peter walking on the water. That's where I'm ready. I'm excited. And so I'm sitting there going, this is great. I was so excited. And I'm not kidding you. The rain was coming horizontally because the wind was blowing so hard. And the boat is going like this. And the people on our tour group are laughing, having a good time. I am laughing, thoroughly enjoying it, thinking, this is great coming to Israel. God gives us real life illustrations. This is absolutely fantastic. So we are there. Literally we're laughing. Especially me. And because I just thinking, how exciting. And we get to the other side. We landed in Tiberias. We get to the other side. The captain and his crew were not happy with me. Because I did not realize they thought this is a life-threatening storm we are in. But to me, we're with Jesus. We're a bunch of people just praising the Lord, reading about this. This is fantastic. But nevertheless, these storms really do happen on the Sea of Galilee. Just like it says here, they just come out of nowhere. When we get over to Tiberias on that trip, all of a sudden the storm stopped. You just get off the boat. It's a perfectly calm day. But this story here from Matthew chapter 22, Mark 6, John chapter 6, or Matthew chapter 14, is the story of faith from beginning to end. Verse 22 tells us that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat to go to the other side. Again, note they're going to get to the other side because he said, you will get to the other side. He made them get into the boat. That term for made, it means to compel by force or persuasion. The picture that Scripture paints is one of the disciples who did not want to go to the other side. They didn't want to get in the boat. It had nothing to do with the storm, but they just didn't want to do it. Sometimes we're that way. We're not really interested in doing what the Lord tells us to do. But they didn't want to go. In fact, the idea to be compelled or by force or persuasion, it paints the picture, although this isn't how it happened, because Jesus is up on a hillside where he can see the disciples, and the disciples are on the shore. The idea with this, the force implied is like this. It's as if the disciples are in the boat and Jesus shoves the boat out into the water. It's that kind of imagery. The disciples really didn't want to go, but they were persuaded, on the inside, because of the words of Jesus, you're going to do this even though you don't want to do it. We've all been there to some extent. If you have kids, you are probably there often, like I am there often. My son doesn't always want to go to school. Anybody else experience that with your kids? All right, so you have to, you need to compel them. You are going to school. You are not really sick. No, you are going to go to school, and if you stay home, you're going to have a fever, and you ain't watching TV. What? Right, so you're compelling them. You know there are lessons they need to learn, and you need to be responsible. I was the worst. My entire school life, I never wanted to go to school. I didn't want to go to kindergarten. I didn't want to go to 12th grade. I didn't want to go to anything in between. It was so bad with me in school that after I graduated from high school, I had all these friends who went through these different colleges. I did not. But I finally decided I needed to get my act together. So I enrolled in a community college in one class. It was business law. For whatever reason, at that time in my life, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. Believe me, it's not here. And so I go to the business law class, and the professor, we're sitting there, I'm listening to the professor talk. It's for like an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes, however long it was, and then you get a 15-minute break, and then come to the class. Okay, first break, first day of class, 15-minute break. Professor says, okay, I'll see you back here in 15 minutes. I got in my car and I went home. That was it. That was me in school. And you know what? It's just sometimes we need to be compelled to do things that we don't necessarily want to do, right? And if you're young and you're listening, you're thinking that's a great idea. It was not a great idea. To this day, I kick myself for not following through when I was younger. But by the grace of God, He still takes care of us. Jesus deliberately sent them to the other side. Jesus deliberately sent them into a storm. They didn't want to go. He made them go. Sometimes the Lord makes us do things and makes us go places we just don't want to go there. There's a lot of things I've done in ministry that I'm thinking I didn't really want to do it. After some time, I'm glad, but there's a lot of things I'm thinking, no. Can I just sleep, Lord? Something like that. He deliberately, he persuaded them. Mark's gospel tells us they were straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Here in verse 24, Matthew says the wind was contrary. The NIV Bible says the wind was buffeting them. The NASB says the wind battered them. Young's translation says they were distressed. Literally, the wind was tormenting them. So these are seasoned fishermen, for the most part. Not all of them, but for the most part. They're seasoned fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. They knew that sea, and they are tormented by what is happening. They're so tormented that when they see Jesus, they think it's got to be a ghost. It's a freak-out time with them. But why did the disciples end up in trouble? Because they pointed their boat in the direction the Lord told them. First takeaway. Sometimes we experience storms in life because we are faithful to the Lord. Do not believe the preacher who tells you or the Christian who tells you. Listen, when you receive Jesus, life is going to be easy. Anybody ever hear that? I hear those teachings. I'm going to tell you the truth, all right? And this is not popular. This is not how to win people to come back to your church. I get that. But I will tell you the truth. When you receive Jesus, He will send you into storms that you didn't want to go through, that you didn't even know existed before. I can assure you, I received Christ, and I was forgiven of sins and all sorts of things, and life changed. It was better, not because I could suddenly pay my bills, right? That didn't work out like that. In fact, I ended up with an IRS problem after I got saved. But it was better because the Lord was with me. It was better because I know I'm going to be forever with the Lord on that day when I am no longer on this earth. But when I received Christ, things didn't get easier for me. In fact, I can assure you things have become, in the sense of things of this world, have become much more difficult, much more trialsome. I am not going to lie to you and tell you if you receive Christ today, life will be easy. Think of it like this. How's that for an altar call? Now, give your life to Jesus, right? But that's truth. Would you rather have the truth? Listen, this is what I know. I'm going to be in the presence of the Lord, and I get to be reunited with anyone who knows the Lord Jesus Christ. And it is going to be awesome forever and ever and ever and ever. And man, that excites me. In the meantime, we get the truth, and we don't always like the truth. But think of it like this. Joseph never would have ended up in prison if he was disobedient to the Lord, right? But because Joseph was obedient, this is Joseph in the Old Testament, because Joseph was obedient, he ended up in prison. But also, if Joseph wasn't obedient to the Lord, he never would have been the number 2 man in all of Egypt that ended up being the person that God used to save the entire nation of the Jewish people. Wow. Daniel, if he was disobedient to the Lord, you want to know what? He never would have ended up in the lion's den. But he was obedient to the Lord, so he ended up in the lion's den. But also, Daniel, if he is disobedient to the Lord, he never would have been one of the greatest men that ever lived in the history of the world. But he was obedient to the Lord. He ended up in the lion's den and ended up being a great man of God. Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, if she was disobedient to the Lord, she could have saved her life of ridicule and mocking and all kinds of things being said about her and the life that she would have lived if she had rejected and decided to be disobedient to the Lord. But she chose to be obedient to the Lord. She was ridiculed. She was mocked throughout her life. We know that from the biblical context of the life of Mary. So she would have been, she was obedient to the Lord. She was mocked and ridiculed. However, if she was disobedient, she never would have been the one to give birth to the Messiah. So you start looking at it through the right perspective. Also understand this. Daniel would have been saved from being eaten by the lions, but he wasn't saved from the lion's den, right? Same with you and me. Sometimes we'll be in the lion's den, but he'll keep us from being eaten by the lions. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the story of the life of Daniel, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. God didn't keep them from the fiery furnace, but he kept them from being burned. Sometimes it feels like our clothes are on fire in the fire while we're in the fire. He doesn't promise to keep us from the fire, but he does promise to keep us from being burned. He doesn't promise to keep us from the storms. He even sends the disciples into the storm. He doesn't promise to keep us from the storms, but as we even see with Peter, he will keep us from drowning in the storm. Number 2, second main point, Jesus sees the disciples in the storm. On my phone, I have 3 weather apps. How many of you have weather apps on your phone? Right? So what you'd know, if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many you have, none of them agree with each other, do they? It's like different temperatures, predictions of rain, dryness, drought, humidity. They never agree with each other. Go figure that one out. So what I can know is this, is 1, either weathermen are highly overpaid, or two, this is what I can know for a fact. Weather predictions must not be easy because they often miss storms or they predict storms that never happen. But the good news with Jesus is this for you and me. Second takeaway, not all storms are picked up on our radar, but they are picked up on his spiritual radar. John's gospel tells us that the disciples are on this boat, in this boat on the Sea of Galilee, and it was dark. Here in Matthew, we find out that they are in the middle of the sea, and the waves were immense. And Matthew doesn't state this, but Mark does. Mark says in Mark chapter 6 that Jesus saw them at rowing. How did Jesus see the disciples at rowing? We don't know. Was it with his physical eyes, or was it because of his omniscience? Because he knew everything, right? Had all knowledge. Did he see them because there's a full moon? Well, it's probably cloudy. There's a storm, right? Or maybe lightning lit up and he could see them with his physical eyes. But regardless of what it was, whether it's omniscience, he knows they're out there, or he physically sees them, we know this. The eye of Jesus was on his children while they were in trouble. Here's our problem. Our problem is that we know the facts. We know this isn't working out. We know everything is going wrong. We know I will never get through this. This is the worst trial of my life. God must not care. God cares about others, but God has forgotten about me. That's the process that we go through in our own mind. When the non-believer thinks if there's a God, he doesn't care or he can't know. A new believer goes through the same process. Well, God cares about other people, and I'm not so sure about me. And even the seasoned believer, the person who's been a believer for years, has learned this, that you go through thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of times of testing, don't you? Every day you go through different types of testing. And you go through one, you get through it. And then after years of following the Lord and growing in your faith, you start to realize something. I'm going to get through this. However, at first, the first thought, even if you've been a believer for years, you've been through 10,000 difficulties. You come to 10,001 and you think, uh-oh, this time it's different. But then, the more you mature in your faith, the quicker you pass on through the this time is different, and you get to the place you go, wait a minute, Lord, 10,001, okay, you're good. And then you hit 10,002. Well, that was yesterday, Lord. He knows when a sparrow falls to the ground. He knows the numbers of hair on our head. For some people, that is way easier than other people. He even said, I will be with you even to the end of the age. He sees us in the storm. Think of it like this. I have 2 kids. There's, 7.5 billion people on the planet or something like that? That's a lot of people. I care more about my 2 kids than all of the other 7+ billion people on the planet. Right? So do you. Right? If I were to circle the earth to and fro with my eyes, I'd be looking for my 2 children more than anybody else's. Does that make sense? God never takes his eyes off of his children. In fact, he looks at each one of us as if we were the only one. He sent his son to die for us, just as if we were the only one. He doesn't take his eyes off of his children. Number 3, Jesus meets the disciples in the middle of the sea. Again, that's what verse 24 says. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. John's gospel says they were 3 to 4 miles out into the Sea of Galilee, which would be right about in the middle. If you've ever been there, you could see that. But think of it like this. In the middle of nowhere is where Jesus met the disciples, and that is where he meets us. Jesus saw the disciples toiling and rowing helplessly, yet he delayed coming to them. He knew their thoughts. He knew they were wondering, what is Jesus going to do about this? He fed all the thousands of people earlier in the same day, right? This is just an extension into the night. He took care of everybody else, but he doesn't care about us 12. He would have known that they were complaining, at least in their minds, wondering because they're human beings. Doesn't he care about us? Doesn't he see us? Doesn't he know that we're the ones that are with him going all throughout the country? Doesn't he know he sent us into the boat? Doesn't he know he made us go to the other side? Doesn't he know there's a storm out here? He could do a miracle for them, but what about for us? Both Matthew and Mark's gospel tell us that when Jesus finally comes to them, when they're in the midst of the sea, in the midst of the storm, it was during the fourth watch. So that would have been between 3 in the morning and 6 in the morning. We know from John's gospel that Jesus, they're in the boat in the evening. So the evening would be somewhere between 6 and 9. So the least amount of time they were on the water in the storm was between 9 p.m. and 3 in the morning, but probably longer than that. Know this, that Israel lays out at almost the exact same latitude that Southern California does. The topography is the same, the weather's the same, very, very similar to Southern California. But also the time that the sun would set would be like it is here, barring the time changes that we do in our culture, right? So last night I look outside and it was just a little bit after 7 that the sun sets, that's getting pretty dark. So in that time, all you got to do is just project back. It would have been about the same time back then with that same latitude in Israel. So it's probably somewhere right around 7 o'clock when evening had come and it's getting dark that the disciples get into the boat. The earliest Jesus came to them is at 3 in the morning, and he could have come to them closer to 5:59 in the morning. He appears to them in the fourth watch of the night. After hours of being on the sea, after hours of being stressed out, after hours of wondering, where is he when we need him most? But why did Jesus delay? Why did he delay? Well, with Mary and Martha, when their brother Lazarus had died, Jesus waited till he was dead for 4 days before he appeared. Why? So they would know that he was the resurrection and the life. In him is life. Why did he delay here? We'll find out when we get to the end. So they would know that Jesus was God. Third takeaway. Sometimes Jesus takes us to the end of ourselves simply because he has to. You know the story of Job? Job is the one who lost everything, right? He lost his children. He lost his servants, he lost his cattle, he lost his business, he lost everything except for his wife. His wife, the one who was kind of mean to him. The wife who said, why don't you just curse God and die? I mean, how would you like to be married to her? Just curse God and die. I don't want you. I mean, you're thinking, Lord, why did you leave her? But, I mean, what would you think? Come on, men. Now, you can raise your hand. If your wife said to you, why don't you curse God and die, what would you think? I don't think she likes me very much. That's what I'd be thinking. I'm just saying. But anyways, Job, he loses everything. His kids, his servants, his business, his health. He loses everything. Of that, Job said this. In other words, before I had my trials and lost everything, before that, my ears had heard of you. But now, after the trials, now my eyes have seen you. God seems, for us human beings, we don't turn to him until we're at the end of ourselves. I know I did not get saved until I was like in the sewer, in the gutter. I was as low as I could get. Finally, at that point, I said, okay, I surrender. Finally. How much grief we could save ourselves, right? If we would just surrender maybe just a little bit earlier. But sometimes Jesus takes us to the end of ourselves because he has to. And ultimately, he's the refiner. He's burning off the dross. We're in the storm. He's molding us, shaping us into the image of Jesus. And what happens next? Verse 27. But immediately Jesus spoke to them. Remember, they said, he's a ghost. That's where we left off. He spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer, it's I. In other words, I'm not a ghost. It's okay. You're watching another miracle. Remember the miracle of the fish and loaves earlier in the day? Now you're seeing me. This is another miracle. Be of good cheer. It is I. Jesus is walking on the water. Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. So Jesus said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Could you imagine seeing that? That's cool. All of a sudden, he's just walking on the water. I think it's pretty cool. Wow. Last main point. Jesus saves a sinking disciple. Verse 30, Peter's walking on the water, but when he saw that the wind was boisterous, Peter was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Two closing thoughts. All right, here they are. They're both pretty quick. Two mistakes to avoid. You ready? One, we tend to assume that my situation is different. Jesus performs this miracle of feeding the thousands and thousands of people earlier in that day. The disciples are now in the water. Oh, it's a ghost. Oh, we're going to die. Oh, oh, oh. They're human beings. Because they're human, they would have wondered, well, that was yesterday. Or that was earlier. You cared about them, but you don't care about me. What are you going to do for me today? Or this, we assume this time it is different. Here's the thing. We change, but the Lord never changes. He never changes. Second mistake we must avoid, we will sink when we take our eyes off Jesus. So Peter, he gets out of the boat. Notice again how John didn't get out of the boat. Just saying. John's gospel versus Matthew's. Peter gets out of the boat. Peter starts walking on the water. Did you notice how this worked? When Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he was doing good. But when he looked and he saw that the wind is boisterous, the waves are boisterous, he's feeling the wind blowing, the right, the left. He takes his eyes off of Jesus. What happens? Boop. Jesus didn't let him drown. We'll go in the fire, but he won't let us get burned. We'll go in the lion's den, but he won't let the lions eat us. He'll let us sink, but he won't let us drown. You're going to go through the storms. You're going to have the waves. You're going to have the wind. These things are going to be happening. The moment you look at your circumstances, you will start to sink. You know, in the Bible, we're never told, look at your circumstances and find your help there. No, you look to Jesus, right? Philippians tells us he will give us understanding that surpasses the circumstances. Or he'll give us peace, that surpasses our understanding. Our understanding is it's windy. Our understanding is the waves are crashing. My understanding is I'm sinking, or I'm going to sink. Peter did great when his eyes were on Jesus. Circumstances were exactly the same. They never changed. The only thing that changed was Peter where he looked. It's the exact same thing for you and I. Let's close with this thought. God helps us get through what we may never get over. There are things that happen in this life, trials, tribulations, fires, storms, lions' dens, that hurt and are hard. Yesterday, there was the most tragic accident I've heard of in so long with a bus in Canada with a youth hockey team that was involved in an accident, almost killed every single child on that bus. I cannot, and the hockey team was from a town that only has 6,000 people. I can't imagine the pain. I can't, folks. It hurts me to just think about it. And I know that the enemy has come to kill and steal and destroy, and God has done something about it. He sent his son. And there's some things that you're not going to get over in this life, but you will get through and you'll reach the other side. I was talking with a lady after first service, and her son's name is Tony. 14 months ago, she came to me and she said, will you pray for my son? We were out here on the courtyard. I said, yes. He was a snowboarder. He was in an accident, had a really bad accident, broke his back, his neck. Doctor said he'll never be able to do anything again. He's just going to be quadriplegic. Nothing's going to work. And we've been praying ever since. And so he now has the ability, he's on crutches. He still's in a wheelchair most of the time, but instead of being a quadriplegic, he's a paraplegic. And we're still praying for him. And she told me she's given me these praise reports along the way, no matter what men have said. Yesterday, she said he went to this event. It's for wheelchair athletes in extreme games. And he's gotten to know some of the people. The person who's the number one guy out of oversees the whole thing came up to him in his wheelchair. He knew about him. And they custom fit him with a wheelchair just for extreme games. They're pouring all this money into him. And he said, I know your testimony. I want you to be the pastor of all of this massive group. And you look at that and you go, why is, 14 months ago, her son was, my life's over, right? But God was doing something greater, reaching him and using him to reach others. That's a remarkable thing. About 5 o'clock this morning, I texted a friend of mine. Can I tell you this? I know I've gone over 2 minutes. Can I? Okay, about 5 o'clock this morning, a friend of mine, I texted him. I've known him since I was 4 years old. He was served with divorce papers just recently, and he's just devastated. He's been married about 30 years. He's just devastated. And I texted him. I said, I'm preparing my heart and my mind for today's message and reminding me of you. I want you to know I'm praying for you. And then I said something to him. I said, I remember what you told me some 30 years ago. It was from Psalm 23, where the psalmist said, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art there with me. And he said to me some 30 years ago, he said, you go through the valley, God doesn't leave you in the valley. And it's even in Psalm 23 where the psalmist wrote, the Lord prepares the table for me in the presence of my enemies. He gives me peace in the presence of all of those things. We go through these things, but he doesn't leave us there. All of this said, this closes with this. Verse 32, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And then those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. That's why we go through stuff. We are going through the valley. Some of you are in it. Some of you are coming out of it. Some of you don't even know there's one coming. But we know this. We're going through it, and one day we're going home with him, and he is molding us into the image of Jesus. Amen?